All right, welcome back. This is a new episode of the Razor podcast, and I wanted to do a little bit of a theme as opposed to just a current events topic. And really, this episode is going to deal with how classical liberalism, the type of liberalism that rational people believe in, sort of devolves into the modern progressive liberal type of thought that clouds people's judgment and has them believe in things that don't actually comport with reality. It makes even good people into very superstitious and often, clownish people, unfortunately. And the reason that I'm making the video is because I do encounter like pretty frequently, especially nowadays with COVID, a lot of people who seem to look at the situation as if they have to live their life with zero risk. They can't simply accept that there's always a danger when you go outside, and that the body is adaptable to adverse conditions. It doesn't mean that you're not ever going to get sick. It means that you are a sophisticated being, and that what your body does is to process the different pathogens that are out there in nature and eventually reach equilibrium. Usually, obviously, there's people who they have conditions that make them more vulnerable, and I'm not saying that you should disregard every risk, but that's just a small part of it. However, before I really start in on the topic, I want you to click the subscribe button on any of the platforms below: Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, for the videos. And you can also find me posting on Minds and Gab, especially on Minds lately. And if you want, you can donate to me on Subscribestar. And there's also two ways to donate through BitChute. Broadly speaking, I think that the person who is most responsible for polluting the concept of what liberalism really means is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Everybody remembers him primarily as the president who introduced the New Deal. He was elected during the Great Depression, and he also guided the U.S. through most of World War II before he died in 1944. And what I want to make clear here is that I'm not trying to demonize him or character assassinate him. He was a deeply flawed person. I think he's given too much credit for many of the accomplishments that are attributed to him, and people don't judge him harshly enough for some of the things that he did regarding the encroachment on the civil liberties of Americans, especially, remember, the Japanese that were put in internment camps. But really, in general, you could say that FDR, while he's seen as an icon of American liberalism, almost turned the U.S. into a fascist state all of its own. I think Dinesh D'Souza talks a little bit more about it. I don't really follow Dinesh D'Souza a lot, but I know that he's dealt with it. So one of the reasons that I think FDR is the person who steered the concept of liberalism away from reason and self reasoning, the ability for every person to draw their own conclusions and make personal decisions as individuals, is because FDR took power during a time of great crisis, really like times that we're living in, and he started to take authorities, he started to take liberties away. He started to accrue authorities for the government, including through acts of Congress, right? So he created a number of initiatives, such as, I think it was the National Labor Relations Board, and the Works Progress Administration, and the Civil Construction Corps, if I'm not mistaken. There's a lot of different programs that FDR started. And the premise of most of these programs was that you could solve many of society's ills during the Great Depression in a time of great crisis through all of these different government initiatives, meaning that, look, society is wrecked. We need, big, bold solutions. We can't wait until the crisis resolves itself. We need to start to think big, and thinking big means thinking collectively as well. So really, you can see just a selection of some of these. You see the WPA over here. You see Social Security, definitely one of the more long-lasting effects of the New Deal. And Americans really love the New Deal. I think that regardless of what one's thoughts are about it, the New Deal was generally one of the most popular, policy platforms that has ever been introduced in a democratic country, because people started to see a purpose in what they were doing. They were basically being often assigned to do things based on what society needed, not based on what they wanted to do themselves individually. And it was a time when personal preference was set aside because people couldn't really pick and choose. They had to take whatever work was offered. There were people who were working in the Great Depression in very menial and backbreaking forms of labor, and then there were people who were set to work putting together some projects like the Hoover Dam, if I'm not mistaken, was completed during that time. The Tennessee Valley Authority, I think the National Highway System at the time. And these are all accomplishments that FDR is remembered for, and rightly so. I think that whatever the flaws of what he did, you have to recognize that the U.S. benefited, at least in terms of infrastructure, from this very adventurous era of using the government's power of the purse and raising taxes in order to generate economic activity through various public works projects. So this was the heyday of Keynesian economics, which is you could classify it as a stream of economics, a sort of a school of thought that says that you're not going to have a totally collectivist society, a socialist society, but what you could do is have a very strong welfare state. It sets up safety nets for the citizens, and the private sector is really just sort of an engine for that, right? So it sees the government as having a more noble role than the private sector, right? Whereas people who are classical liberals or libertarians, they see the role of the state as much more limited. They see it as a little bit of a necessary evil. The people who are Keynesian economists, they see the state as the real conduit for prosperity for the public, right? They don't see business as looking after the interests of the public, because the business is inevitably selfish and cynical, right? Any business seeks to maximize its profit. It's not there to aid the other people, the people who are not part of the business, including the workers and everybody. So they see the role of the government as looking after the interests of the people who are not being benefited by, or who are not getting the fair share that the business gives to them. So that's in a very generalized way. Unfortunately, I have to generalize here, but that's the way that modern liberalism likes to look at the role of the government, meaning that the government, since FDR, is seen as the real parent for many people who are born into unfortunate circumstances or arrive at unfortunate circumstances for whatever reason, whether it's one of their immutable characteristics, such as their gender or race or whatever, or because of a disability, right? or if they're orphaned, any one of several factors. So the state is the one that is charged with helping to keep them in a situation where they can get their basic needs and possibly flourish and become more successful. That's the idea behind it. In reality, it doesn't really work that way, because we see that a lot of the initiatives that started in the 30s, things like public housing, things like Social Security and welfare and everything, that while they aim to curtail poverty and look after the interests of working people and the poor, they don't really resolve any of those issues, right? You don't leave poverty by getting benefits from the government. This is something that many people have already discussed ad nauseum. You could probably look at Thomas Sowell. You could probably look at Milton Friedman, two major libertarian economists, and that's really what I believe. So that was the evolution of classical liberalism prior to FDR, right? Some of these things already were starting before FDR, but he was the president who really, he got the ball rolling. He got the snowball rolling down the hill on modern liberalism, and not just in my opinion, but in the opinion of many critics of modern liberalism. So you could see that with several presidents that came afterward, right? FDR is still seen as an icon of the liberal left, at least many of the people on the liberal left. The Democrats, and with them the majority of Americans who define themselves as liberals, they always seemed to look at the government as the real agent for social change and solving people's problems. You can see that under Lyndon Johnson with his Great Society programs. You can see that under Barack Obama with various initiatives such as the Shovel Ready program and Cash for Clunkers, and some of the different stimulus programs that he did, Obamacare, right? And I would say that the one president that sort of broke that mold was Bill Clinton. He sort of had to go a different way, largely because of political realities. We're not going to dwell on that. We're going to go through a few values that I see where there's a huge difference between classical liberalism and the modern liberalism, the type that leads to progressivism, right? Because a lot of these modern liberals, they're very soft in their thinking, and they can easily morph into progressives based on just the type of reasoning that they start to consume, the type of thinking that they begin to exhibit, right? So I'm going to try to state it this way. So a classical liberal will usually oppose irrational traditions or superstitions. And a good example of this, which is, and it's not a political example. Here in the U.S., we have, every February, we have Groundhog Day. And it's a superstition, right? And on Groundhog Day, that's, I think, the first week of February, in Pennsylvania, there's a town called Punxsutawney where a groundhog pokes his head out of his burrow. And if he sees his shadow and he crawls back, that means there's 6 more weeks of winter. And if he stays outside, that means that winter is soon going to be finished. And that's a big superstition. Now, while it's a tradition, a rational person knows that just because Punxsutawney Phil may not crawl back into his burrow, that doesn't mean that all of the snow crews that are on the highways in Pennsylvania are going to take the rest of the winter off. Like, people know that you have to depend on weather reports. You have to depend on, even though weather reports aren't dependable either many times, but they're more dependable than a superstition that's connected to a groundhog. So that's the way that you disregard traditions that are irrational. And one of the reasons that I'm using this as a big issue with modern liberalism modern liberalism leading to progressivism, is because they seem to lose that, right? They seem to often latch onto things. Now, they don't look at these traditions or superstitions in the way that you might look at somebody who, counts the rosary, or if they are, there's every religion has its superstitions. If you believe in any of these, I'm not knocking you, but a liberal traditionally doesn't believe in them, right? They sort of look at these as, kind of cute, but, dumb practices that people have that they think are going to intervene in their personal life. And a liberal person will generally not accept that as fact. Now, nowadays, you have speech codes. You have liberals are telling people what to say and what not to say. They say, well, just because you can say something doesn't mean you ought to say it, or that you should say it, right? They think that words are capable of harming people, right? And as a real rational person would probably think that's not true, right? The way that words harm you is if you let them harm you. You let them affect you, right? If you are defiant and if you see somebody else's harmful words as being meaningless because you don't really see them as important, that diminishes their power. But once you believe that someone has the power to affect your life by calling you a certain name, or by making like a very casual aside, saying something that might be stereotypical, and for example, if they say that, if they try to say, for example, that you have, you're cheap, right, and you happen to be Jewish like myself, and you take great offense to that, and you see that as some sort of imposition on your character. Now, it might well be, but so what? I mean, the life goes on. In the end, people's remarks about other people, they have only the amount of effect that the person who receives them allows them to have. So that's the first value where I see a difference between classical liberalism and modern liberalism, which leads to progressivism, which is that you do see modern liberals embracing some of these ridiculous traditions and chants and things like that. Things like say his name whenever there's one of these people who's been shot by the police, as if it really matters. And it does take on a religious flavor, right? And that is not really along the lines of what liberalism traditionally meant. So along that line, traditionally, not just in the United States, but back in Europe, a liberal was a person who advocated for separation of church and state, and for reducing the power of the clergy within society to encroach on the lives of people who are lay people. In modern liberalism and progressivism, they don't really do that as much. They protect certain doctrines, whether they're academic doctrines, right? So if you believe, for example, that there are two genders, and that transgenderism is not really, it doesn't really mean, like, if you're a transgender person, that you constitute a third gender, or that you are somehow able to craft your identity based on your preference rather than on your biological makeup. They look at that as some sort of blasphemy, right? And even the way that I phrase that is considered blasphemy, because I use words like preference, I use words like crafting, as if they have an intent rather than if it's natural. So this notion that people have to believe as if this is some sort of real, creed, an underlying creed, that is not an element of classical liberalism. That is an element of it's, if anything, it's skewing towards a new religion. And people talk about this. I'm not the only person who talks about this. I'm sure many people have talked about it. I've heard the word cathedral bandied about. concerning the woke philosophy and things like that. So that is another element where I would say classical liberalism has been abandoned by people who call themselves liberals. It's not actually the people who call themselves liberals, by the way, they will never be able to explain really what the philosophy of liberalism is nowadays. They don't know it. And I think that if you asked and polled people and you asked them what are the underpinnings of being a liberal, you'll get very, very different answers. I think you could say the same thing about conservatism. There's other very hazy and unclear definitions of modern conservatism too. But we're not talking about that right now, because I think conservatives know that conservatism is in trouble. I don't think many liberals know that they're not even really liberal. So another example of a value where it's become different is that modern progressives and modern liberalism does not distinguish between something that's a willful and malicious act and an accident. And the best example that I can bring is, if you remember, I think it was last year, there was a woman who was walking in Central Park with her dog named Amy Cooper, and she had some sort of confrontation with a guy who was there bird watching, and the guy happened to be a black guy. I think his name was Eric Cooper or something, and he alleged that she was calling the police on him because she was racist, and there's like a whole stupid story behind it. And the reality is, I think you just had, in this case, two people who were one of them seems to be a person who's very confrontational. This is the guy who's looking for a reason to complain about someone. And the other person seems like very oblivious and clueless, Amy Cooper. And they happen to cross paths. And my belief is this. She didn't call the cops on him because she's racist. She called the cops on him because she's a dopey moron, and that whenever she feels the least bit threatened, yes, she'll call the cops on people. But I think she would call the cops on him if he was white. I think she would have called the cops on him if he was Asian. I think she would have called the cops on him if he was wearing a mask and she couldn't see what race he was. Now, those are all what if situations, but the notion that we can just conclude, based on the fact that she was white and he was black, that she called the cops on him simply because she is racist and that she is conditioned to feel threatened by a black person. No, that's an assumption. That's something that I think people will, they would regret if it ever happened in their own life, that they would have to call the police to be helped because someone is assaulting them in the park or whatever. So it never ends. You need people to report crimes if they're actually being victimized. Otherwise, the next person, if this person goes free and victimizes another person, in a sense, the first victim is, they didn't really do anything to prevent the next one, right? So you can't just call people who are summoning the police to help them racist simply because of the identity of the caller and the identity of the person who is being reported. It just doesn't work that way. We got two more values, and then we're going to wrap up. Another value is the ability to take or abandon a position based on data and evidence rather than public perception, public pressure and peer trends. So, or peer pressure, whatever you want to say. And good examples of these are the Iraq War, Russiagate, and COVID-19. And I'm using these examples for a specific reason. The people who in 2002 and 2003 opposed the Iraq War, and I was in high school, I wasn't politically active, I would say at the time I thought the Iraq War was a good idea, but I wasn't really a major stakeholder in it. Again, I was a junior in high school. So, and I never ended up serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. I served overseas for the Israeli Army. But in retrospect, I think that you have to recognize that the liberals and the progressives who opposed the war at the time, even people you don't like, people like Michael Moore, yeah, they had a point that people weren't really examining the evidence. They were being gullible. They were believing what the CIA told them. They were, buying it hook, line, and sinker and just being credulous idiots. That doesn't mean you have to like everything that Michael Moore says from there on. It doesn't mean that because he may have been right about that issue and that Noam Chomsky and other far left people were right about the Iraq War, as were a few people on the right, like Ron Paul. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with literally everything else that comes out of their mouth. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with Noam Chomsky about the economy or agree with Michael Moore about, some of his stuff concerning universal health care and passage of more firearms control bills and things like that. You can agree with one person on one issue without agreeing with them on everything else. With regards to Russiagate, that's really when American liberals started to completely, the mask began to totally slip, and it started to be apparent that everything that they had supposedly upheld during the Iraq War era, which had to do with, waiting for the evidence to come in, not jumping to a conclusion before you have that evidence. They'd thrown it out the window, right? And instead of processing that, just like with Iraq, you rushed headlong into war. With Russiagate, they were rushing headlong into a new Cold War with Russia that doesn't really have a necessity at this point. They were also ruining the lives of several people who were unfairly targeted by the legal system during that period. People like George Papadopoulos, people like Roger Stone, who's still being hounded, people like Michael Flynn. And modern liberals, this is really a black eye in their face, because typically a liberal would stand with the rights of the accused, stand with the rights of defendants, even defendants who may have had a very clear evidence of guilt, right? That they had them, for example, if it's a murderer, God forbid, they have the murder weapon on them. They may even have a signed confession or whatever. So the traditional liberal, classical liberal, I should say, looks at a perpetrator and says, yes, they may be guilty, but they still deserve due process, and they still deserve to have the legal system deal with them in an unbiased and unconflicted way. And that's not what happened in Russiagate. You see many conflicts of interest, including having someone like Andrew McCabe in charge of the Russiagate investigation for a portion, and he was even acting head of the FBI for a while. So they really did start to lose their minds with Russiagate to such an extent that it became impossible to really take many of them seriously. And then now you're seeing the same thing with COVID-19. So many of them, they virtue signal about the mask. They virtue signal about the fact that, they come out and tell you, oh, I had the vaccine today. I got my second shot today, whatever. And it's a lot of performative arts. It's people trying to make conversation in order to sound like they're with the moment of this vaccination, or that they're wearing masks because, oh, I wear the masks because I care about other people. I'm being altruistic. That is an element of modern liberalism. It's not as much an element of the classical liberal, because classical liberals generally understand that, yeah, people have personal variations, personal differences with their peers, that mean that not everybody can think the same. That they also mean that, yes, you got the vaccine. Well, so what? It's not like some sort of accomplishment that somebody else stuck some sort of pharmaceutical drug or inoculation in your bloodstream. That's something that if you really want the vaccine that bad, good for you, but you don't have to tell everyone. So that is that's that value. So the last one is the ability to evaluate a dispute based on the merits of each position rather than personal connections. So this is something that's very easy. Like, for example, I have never been a real supporter of President Biden. I think he's an awful president. But at the same time, I think you do have to give him credit. He did recognize the Armenian genocide, something that Armenians in America and abroad have wanted for a long while. They want to be acknowledged for the tragedy that happened to their people. The U.S. holds a lot of events for the Holocaust. There's a lot of stuff in the media and in schools about slavery. There's a lot of stuff about the struggle of women for suffrage and everything like that. And the Armenians do want to be recognized for the pain and suffering that their ancestors had during the Armenian genocide. It doesn't mean that you have to rub it in the face of the Turks and say, "Hey, you're guilty. You may think you got away from it after all these years of not being held accountable, but you are being held accountable." So you don't have to do that. But I think recognizing that there was a genocide, recognizing that the tragedy was a willful and evil plan to exterminate the Armenians, I agree with President Biden on. Likewise, even though I've supported President Trump on a lot of initiatives, and I've seen that he, I think on the whole he was a better president than many of the presidents that came before him, and especially the president that's in office now. I disagree with him about this notion that we should push people to get the vaccine, that we should that Johnson & Johnson's vaccine should have been yanked and suspended from distribution because of a number of defects that arose. I don't remember the specifics, but they arose, I think, a week and a half ago. I disagree with what Donald Trump said when he issued some sort of statement where he says that it's all about screwing Johnson & Johnson in order to benefit Pfizer and Moderna. No, I think Donald Trump is being ridiculous. First of all, he should tell people, well, it's okay, so it's your choice whether to get the vaccine or not. I would take the vaccine, meaning Donald Trump would take the vaccine, but I understand if you don't want to take it, but I still encourage you to do so because it's my personal opinion and I've had it. Well, instead he's simply going along with the crowd and saying, yeah, everybody should get the vaccine. That's not really the position I can support. I oppose Biden for it too. I think that people should have informed consent, meaning that people should be educated on the risks of taking any vaccine before they do take it. And I think in this case, it's certainly true because there isn't as long of a track record with this vaccine. So that's about it for today. Please like, share, and subscribe. I hope I sort of showed you a lot of the different mental processes that go into being either a classical liberal or a modern liberal or progressive. And that's about it. You can find me on all the platforms below, as I said earlier, and put a comment below if you want. Have a great Wednesday.